After the death of a loved one, some people need the house full of others. They need voices in the background just to get through the evening. And some people need the opposite. They need the quiet. They need the door closed. They need the room still enough for their thoughts to catch up. And when those two needs collide, it can start to feel like something's wrong. Wrong with you, wrong with them, wrong with the way that you're grieving. But what if nothing is wrong? What if the difference is about wiring and not weakness? Today, we're going to talk about why connection feels so different in grief, depending on your personality, and what actually helps your system to stabilize after loss. I'm Eddie Trauber. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and supervisor. And for over 3 decades, I've sat with people in some of the most intense seasons of their lives. And one thing I've seen over and over again in these grief situations is that the way someone moves toward or away from connection isn't random. It's deeply tied to their temperament and to how their energy gets restored. You see, early on in grief, most people are simply trying to survive the impact. Their sleep cycles change, their appetite changes, their body can feel heavy or restless or numb, and in that fog, differences that once felt small can suddenly feel amplified. If you're someone who normally recharges by being with other people, isolation may make your thoughts louder. Silence can feel suffocating. Being alone with the loss can feel like you're standing in an empty house that just echoes too much. On the other hand, if you're someone who gets their energy restored in peace and quiet, then constant interaction can drain what little emotional energies you have left. Even friends or family who only want to help support you can feel like pressure. Conversations can feel like too much input when your system's already overloaded. Neither response is wrong, but when people don't understand what's happening, they often interpret those differences as insensitivity or rejection or indifference. I once worked with a couple who lost their adult son unexpectedly. In the weeks after the funeral, the husband wanted people in their home almost every night. He told me it was the only time he could breathe. When his friends or family were there, the house felt less empty. For him, hearing stories about his son made it seem like he was still there with them. His wife, however, felt the opposite way. Every knock on the door made her whole body tense up. She loved her son, but it just felt like she didn't love him as much as her husband did. But she felt like she had to be on and put on a performance every time somebody walked in. What she wanted was the curtains closed and the house quiet. Neither of them were wrong. They were simply regulating differently, and without understanding that, they began assuming the worst of each other. Grief can bring that kind of secondary loss, not just the death itself, but the misunderstanding that follows. So let's slow this down. When a death happens, your whole system shifts into survival mode. It starts scanning for safety. It starts scanning for what's missing. For some people, safety is found in closeness to others. Hearing another human voice is comforting and it lowers their internal alarm. Eye contact helps to steady their body. Crying with someone makes something that seems unbearable feel just slightly more okay. And for other people, safety is found in quiet and predictability. Too many voices are not only loud, but they also increase the person's internal noise. Too much interaction makes their body tense instead of calm. For them, solitude allows their system to process without adding stress. The problem is our culture tends to assume one version of grieving is healthier than the other. If you withdraw, people get worried about you. If you seek constant company, people sometimes assume you're avoiding your feelings. And because of those assumptions, a lot of grieving people start judging themselves. They ask themselves questions like, am I isolating too much? Does my leaning on people mean that I'm too needy? Am I doing this wrong? Their internal questions add another layer of strain to their already exhausted system. So before we go any further, let me clarify something. Grief doesn't erase your personality, it intensifies it. Understanding that can change how you respond to yourself and to the people around you. Let's look first at the introverted griever. When someone who tends to be more introverted experiences grief, the loss doesn't suddenly make them want constant interaction. Quite often, the opposite happens. Their internal world becomes even more active. Their thoughts get deeper. Memories replay in their head, and emotions are intense, and sometimes they're hard for them to access in conversation. And let me correct a common myth. Introversion isn't shyness. It's not social fear. It's largely about energy. Introverted nervous systems recharge in lower stimulated environments. Conversation requires emotional energy. Being observed by other people requires emotional energy. Responding in real time requires emotional energy. And grief already demands enormous amounts of internal emotional energy. A lot of introverted people process emotions inwardly before they speak. They feel first and then they search for language. After a death, they may continue their connection to their loved one through memory and reflection. For example, they may replay conversations repeatedly in their mind, or they may quietly sit in their favorite spot and look at pictures of the person they lost. The bond continues internally. For some, that solitude feels stabilizing. It reduces external input so they can begin absorbing what's happened. When everything inside feels overstimulated, a state of quiet can lower the volume just enough for the body to begin to relax. If you look across Scripture, there's a repeated rhythm of withdrawing to quiet places to reconnect with God. Moses steps away to the mountain. Elijah moves into the wilderness. Jesus often pulls back from the crowds to pray alone. Again and again, the movement is away from the noise towards silence. Not because people don't matter, but because quiet creates space for connection with God. There's a kind of stability that can't grow in constant motion. Busyness can be distracting. Conversation can help distribute the weight of the burden, so you're not carrying it all by yourself. But solitude allows the experience to settle. It gives your body room to slow down. It allows your nervous system to recalibrate. For some personalities, especially in grief, that kind of quiet is not about escape, it's about stabilization. But solitude in grief is complex. That same quiet that feels protective can slowly begin to amplify distress. In the early weeks, many introverted clients tell me, I just need space. And that's real. Their body's overloaded, their mind is saturated. Space allows their system to downshift and relax a little bit. Yet when someone significant is missing, your attachment system stays activated. Your mind keeps scanning for what used to be there. If you sit alone for long stretches without any relational grounding, that scanning can turn into what's called looping. Years ago, I worked with a woman in her 40s who had lost her sister to cancer. As an introvert, she had always valued quiet. And in the first couple of months after the funeral, she declined almost every invitation to be around other people. At first, it felt peaceful to her, but by the third or fourth month, she noticed something had shifted. She wasn't just resting, she was replaying. The same hospital images resurfaced in her mind every night. She described the silence as heavier than it was when the loss actually occurred. Her temperament wasn't the problem, but her isolation had crossed from restorative and helpful to restrictive and harmful. Another one of my clients, a college-age man who had lost his father suddenly, found that he spent hours alone scrolling through his old messages from his dad. It helped him to feel connected. But the problem was he stopped responding to his friends, and weeks had passed without him really talking to anyone. And eventually he began interpreting that quiet as abandonment, even though he was the one that had created it. His nervous system was activated first by the loss itself, and then again by the interpretation of isolation that followed. You see, when an introverted griever over-isolates, the system loses relational buffering. Humans regulate one another. Our tone of voice, facial expression, shared presence. These aren't small things. They serve to steady our heart rate. They soften tension. And without this relational buffering, the body works harder when it's by itself. The positive is that solitude can feel safe because it lowers stimulation. But the negative, if it goes on too long, is that it can feel isolating because it removes support. Over time, this isolation can develop into a subtle narrative of, I'll just handle this myself. No one really understands anyway. That belief may protect you in the short term, but it can shrink your world. For introverts, the goal isn't to become more extroverted. It's to find measured, intentional connection that doesn't overwhelm your system. One tool I often suggest is structured companionship. Not open-ended socializing, not large gatherings, but one person, clearly defined meetings, a 30-minute walk once a week, sitting in the same room as a friend while you're both reading, coffee with a defined beginning and end. The predictability of this really matters. You know who's going to be there, you know how long it's going to last, and that reduces the stress of anticipation while still offering co-regulation. I worked with a man who lost his wife after 30 years of marriage. Big gatherings just drained him, but he agreed to walk with his neighbor every Tuesday morning. Sometimes they talked about the loss, and sometimes they talked about the weather. But that small rhythm kept his world from shrinking too much. His solitude remained intact, it just wasn't absolute. Now let's talk about the extroverted griever. For someone whose energy moves outward, grief can feel unbearable in silence. The house feels too still. The absence feels louder when no one else is there. Where an introvert may feel flooded by too much interaction, an extrovert may feel flooded by too little. Extroversion is also about regulation. For a lot of extroverts, things inside begin to steady when there's another person in the room. Conversation helps organize what feels scattered. Emotional connection spreads the weight of the grief so it's not carried alone. And being with people isn't just a preference for them, it's part of how their system stabilizes. After a death, that stabilizing effect becomes even more important. Shared presence lowers the internal alarm. Voices in the room soften the sense of emptiness. I worked with a woman in her 60s who lost her husband suddenly, and in the first month, she invited friends over nearly every evening, but her children worried that she wasn't really grieving. They saw the house full and assumed she was avoiding the pain. But she told me, when my friends are here, I can breathe. And she wasn't avoiding it. After everyone left, then she cried. Then she processed what she had been feeling. What her children didn't see was that the presence of others didn't erase her grief. It helped her to carry it in small portions. Conversation steadied her. For her, telling the story again and again wasn't just repetition, it was processing. Each time she said it out loud, her mind was trying to integrate the shock of what had happened. Connection didn't remove her sorrow, it regulated her enough to survive it. Ecclesiastes 4, 9, and 10 says, "Two are better than one. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up." That passage reflects something deeply human. We're designed for mutual support. But extroversion in grief carries risks too. Because connection helps regulate, there can be a subtle shift over time. What begins as something stabilizing can gradually turn into something constant. If every quiet moment feels unsettled or exposed, it becomes tempting to crowd it out. More gatherings, more conversations, more time at work. The television stays on, the phone stays active. There's always something happening. And at first, that can feel like relief. But when the space is always filled, there's very little room left for the internal experience to actually surface. The emotion doesn't disappear, it just waits. Constant engagement can delay direct contact with what's happening inside. Not because the person's unwilling, but because quiet feels harder to tolerate than activity. And over time, that imbalance can begin to wear on the system in a different way. Avoidance in grief doesn't always look like denial. Sometimes it looks like busyness. If internal emotion never has space to surface, it doesn't disappear, it waits. Then, when a quiet moment finally comes, perhaps late at night, the wave can feel overwhelming because it's been deferred. For extroverts, the work isn't to eliminate connection, it's to balance it. So I often suggest intentional quiet windows, not forced isolation, just a small, time limited space each day without conversation or media, 10 or 15 minutes. The goal isn't to achieve insight, it's to simply notice what's present. Because the window is brief and predictable, it feels manageable. And afterwards, connection can resume. I once worked with a client who told me she couldn't really think unless she was talking. Conversation was how she sorted things out. So we agreed to experiment with something small, just a 15-minute window each afternoon. The first few days were uncomfortable. She felt restless. She kept reaching for her phone. The silence left her feeling exposed. But a couple of weeks in, she began to notice something subtle. When she talked with friends later in the day, her words came out more clearly. She wasn't scrambling for language. She wasn't reacting as quickly. She'd already spent a little time making contact with what was happening inside. The quiet hadn't replaced connection, it had deepened it. Her connection remained a vital part of her day, it just became integrated. As we step back and look at both patterns, what actually helps begins to emerge. Lowering pressure is foundational. You don't have to grieve like someone else. Introverts don't need to force constant social engagement. Extroverts don't need to apologize for needing the presence of other people. Predictable connection steadies the system. A weekly therapy session, a standing grief support group, a regular walk, a consistent church service. Predictability communicates stability in a season defined by instability. Counseling can be especially helpful because it offers something very steady and intentional, a kind of built-in support for your nervous system. The appointment time is set. The space is consistent. You're not wondering how long you're allowed to talk or whether you're burdening someone. There's no need to manage the room. You don't have to protect anyone else from your emotion. You don't have to translate your grief into something more comfortable for the listener. That freedom allows the nervous system to stop bracing. For introverts, counseling provides connection without overload. You can move slowly. You can sit with a thought before speaking it. Silence is not awkward there. It becomes usable. It becomes part of the work. For extroverts, counseling gives the conversation depth. You're not just describing events, you're making contact with the emotion beneath them. And that steady pace helps the experience take shape in a way that feels more grounded. Over time, that consistent rhythm begins to matter. You know the space, you know the hour, and your body starts to associate that steadiness with safety. In a season where so much feels unpredictable, that kind of reliability can be quite stabilizing. Grief support groups can offer something similar, but in a slightly different way. There's a shared experience, there's turn taking, there's witnessing, and those aren't small things. When someone else describes a feeling that you've struggled to name, something shifts internally. You realize you're not the only one having that reaction. And that recognition lowers isolation in a very quiet but powerful way. Support groups also create structure. There's a beginning and an ending, and clear norms for listening and speaking. That predictability helps the nervous system to settle. You don't have to educate people about grief. Everyone there already understands why you're there. There's also something regulating about turn taking. When one person speaks and another listens attentively, it models containment. Emotions can rise, be expressed, and then settle. That rhythm teaches the body that grief doesn't have to be chaotic to be real. And witnessing matters. When someone else nods or gently reflects back to you what you've said, it communicates, I see it, I hear it, that makes sense. The body responds to that kind of validation. Your heart rate steadies, shoulders lower and relax. The experience feels less solitary. For introverts, groups can reduce isolation without demanding constant speaking. You can participate at your own pace. Simply listening can be regulating. For extroverts, groups provide structured space to process without overwhelming one person in your life. The weight is distributed across the circle. And over time, something else begins to happen. You watch others move through different phases of grief. You see someone who's a few months ahead of you. You see someone who's a few years out. And that perspective gently expands your sense of possibility without forcing hope. Grief groups don't remove the loss, but they normalize the terrain. And that normalization alone can be deeply stabilizing. There's something unique about physical presence in these spaces. When we sit across from someone who's calm, whose breathing is steady, whose face conveys empathy, your own system begins to mirror that steadiness. We borrow calm from one another. Online support can reduce loneliness, but some of the cues our nervous systems rely on don't translate fully through a screen. When we're face to face, we borrow regulation in ways that are harder to access digitally. You see, when someone sits across from you and simply stays there, your system learns that sorrow can be survived in the company of others. For introverts, that may look like slowly opening the circle just enough so solitude doesn't turn into isolation. And for extroverts, it might mean allowing a little more stillness so being with others doesn't replace being with your own experience. Neither path is about becoming someone different. It's about learning how to move through grief in a way that fits how you're wired. When we understand those differences, something shifts. Comparison eases. Tension inside families begins to settle. The energy once spent defending the way that you cope becomes available for the work of grieving itself. You may find that quiet restores you, or that conversation steadies you. Both are ways your nervous system is trying to survive something painful. The question isn't which style is healthier. The question is whether your pattern is helping you move through the loss or keeping you stuck in it. Grief doesn't change who you are at your core. It reveals how you restore yourself under stress and strain. And when you understand that, you stop fighting your wiring. You start working with it. So if you've been questioning the way that you cope, I hope this gives you some clarity. Not pressure, not comparison, just understanding. And understanding helps you steady your system so you can make progress and move forward through your grief. Now, if this conversation resonated with you, there are more videos in this series that look at grief through both a biblical and therapeutic lens. If you'd like to keep walking through this together, I'd invite you to watch another one of them. For now, take a slow breath, pay attention to the kind of connection that brings steadiness to your heart this week, and allow yourself to move toward that without self-criticism. See you next time.